He looked like any other passenger trying to catch the last flight out. Worn jeans, a wrinkled shirt, a backpack that had seen better days. When he approached the gate, the security officer barely glanced at his boarding pass before shaking his head. "Sir, this flight is restricted. Military personnel only. You can't board this aircraft." The man nodded quietly, stepped aside, and seemed to disappear into the crowd. 20 minutes later, the same security officer watched in stunned silence as that same man walked past in a flight suit, climbed into the cockpit, and fired up engines that hadn't run in 3 years. What happened next revealed a truth that changed everything they thought they knew about the quiet stranger who'd been turned away at the gate. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden identity, respect, and the moment when the impossible became routine, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that true legends don't need to announce themselves, hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that matter most. LaGuardia Airport, Terminal C, Gate 47. The kind of gate that most passengers walk past without noticing, tucked away in a corner where the lighting was dimmer and the foot traffic lighter. It wasn't designed for commercial flights or tourist destinations. Gate 47 was reserved for military charters, government transports, and aircraft that carried passengers whose destinations weren't listed on any departure board. Security Officer Marcus Webb had been working this section for 8 years, long enough to recognize the patterns that most people missed. Military personnel moved with a certain bearing, a precision in their steps that civilian training couldn't replicate. Government contractors carried themselves differently, conscious of security protocols and classified information that shaped how they interacted with the world. And then there were the others, the ones whose presence at Gate 47 raised questions that Webb had learned not to ask. Tonight was different. Flight 847, scheduled for departure at 2,330 hours, wasn't on any public manifest. The aircraft itself was AC-130 Hercules that had been sitting on a restricted tarmac for 3 years, officially decommissioned, unofficially maintained for purposes that weren't discussed in staff meetings. The passenger manifest showed 12 names, all with security clearances that required verification through channels Webb didn't have access to. But the man approaching his checkpoint didn't look like he belonged on any military transport. Average height, maybe 50 years old, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. His shoes were scuffed leather, not military issue. His backpack was civilian, the kind sold at sporting goods stores to weekend hikers. Everything about him suggested a tourist who'd taken a wrong turn and ended up in the wrong part of the airport. Webb checked the manifest again as the man approached. 12 authorized passengers, all accounted for. No additional clearances, no last-minute additions. The protocol was clear. No exceptions, no deviations, no passengers without proper authorization. "Evening, sir," Webb said, extending his hand for the boarding pass. "I'll need to see your ticket and identification." The man reached into his backpack and produced a standard boarding pass, the kind printed at any airline kiosk. Flight 847, C-12A, departure time 23:30. But when Webb scanned the barcode, his terminal flashed red. Invalid ticket. Passenger not authorized. "Sir, I'm showing this as an invalid boarding pass. This flight is restricted to military personnel with proper clearances." The man nodded, unsurprised by the response. "I understand. Thank you for checking." He turned to walk away, but Webb caught something in his eyes. Not disappointment or frustration, but a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd been turned away from something he was trying to reach. There was also something else, something that Webb couldn't quite identify. A calmness that seemed out of place for someone who'd just been denied boarding on what was probably an important flight. "Sir," Webb called after him, "if this is an emergency or if you have special circumstances, I can contact my supervisor." The man paused, turned back with a slight smile. "That's kind of you, but it's not necessary. Sometimes things work out the way they're supposed to." And then he was gone, disappearing into the sparse crowd of late-night travelers, as if he'd never been there at all. Webb made a note in his log. Unauthorized passenger denied boarding. 2,315 hours. Standard procedure, by the book denial. Nothing unusual except for the nagging feeling that he just made a mistake he didn't understand yet. 20 minutes later, Webb's radio crackled with a message that made him question everything he thought he knew about his job. Security Station 7. This is flight operations. Flight 847 is clear for departure. All personnel and passengers are authorized and accounted for. Webb keyed his radio. Flight operations, this is Security Station 7. I show 11 passengers clear for boarding. One unauthorized individual was denied access at 2,315 hours. Negative, Security Station 7. All passengers are properly authorized. Flight 847 is cleared for immediate departure. Webb looked at his log, then at the empty gate area where the man in worn jeans had stood just 20 minutes earlier. 11 authorized passengers. 1 denial. The math didn't work, but his radio was telling him that somehow it did. Through the terminal windows, he could see the C-130 Hercules that had been sitting dormant on the tarmac for 3 years. But tonight was different. Tonight, there were lights in the cockpit, ground crew moving around the aircraft with purpose, and the distinctive whine of engines spinning up for the first time since the aircraft had been officially decommissioned. Webb grabbed his binoculars, military surplus equipment that helped to monitor the restricted areas of the tarmac. Through the lenses, he could see figures moving around the aircraft, but at this distance, identification was impossible. What he could see was a methodical preparation of an aircraft for flight, the kind of precision that came from years of experience with this specific type of transport. The cockpit lights were on, which meant someone was running pre-flight checks. But according to his information, Flight 847 was being operated by contract pilots, civilians with military transport experience who were cleared for this type of mission. The problem was that the C-130 Hercules was a civilian aircraft. It was a military transport that required specialized training, current certifications, and familiarity with systems that weren't taught in civilian flight schools. Webb's radio crackled again. All stations, Flight 847 is beginning taxi procedures. Repeat, Flight 847 is cleared for immediate departure. Through his binoculars, Webb watched the massive aircraft begin its slow movement toward the active runway. The engines were running smoothly. The taxi speed was precise, and everything about the aircraft's movement suggested it was being operated by someone with extensive experience in this type of transport, which raised a question that Webb couldn't answer. If the contract pilots were civilians, how were they demonstrating the kind of precision that usually came from years of military transport experience? As the aircraft reached the runway threshold, Webb caught a glimpse of the cockpit through his binoculars. For just a moment, the interior lighting revealed the pilot's profile. Average build, maybe 50 years old, wearing a flight suit that looked like it had been through years of use. And something about the silhouette was familiar, naggingly familiar, like a face he'd seen recently but couldn't quite place. The realization hit him with the force of understanding that comes when scattered pieces suddenly form a complete picture. The man he'd turned away at the gate, the man in worn jeans and a wrinkled shirt, carrying a backpack that had seen better days. The same man who had accepted denial with the calm resignation of someone who understood that complications were simply part of the process. Webb grabbed his radio. Flight operations, this is Security Station 7. I need immediate verification of pilot credentials for Flight 847. Security Station 7. Flight crew is properly certified and cleared for this mission. What's the nature of your concern? But Webb couldn't explain his concern because it didn't make sense. How does a man who gets denied boarding at a security checkpoint end up in the pilot's seat of a military transport that's been grounded for 3 years? How does someone in civilian clothes transform into the qualified pilot of an aircraft that requires military certification? As Flight 847 lifted off into the night sky, its navigation lights disappearing into the darkness, Webb realized that the questions he was asking weren't going to be answered through normal channels. This was something beyond standard operating procedures, beyond the security protocols he'd been trained to follow, beyond the comfortable certainty that people were exactly who they appeared to be. The next morning, Webb arrived at work 30 minutes early, determined to find answers to questions that had kept him awake most of the night. His first stop was a flight operations office, where he hoped to find records of Flight 847 crew manifests and some explanation for what he'd witnessed. Janet Morrison, the day's shift supervisor, looked up from her coffee when Webb knocked on her door. "Marcus, you're early. Everything okay?" "Janet, I need to ask you about Flight 847 last night. The C-130 that departed from Gate 47. Morrison's expression shifted from casual friendliness to something more guarded. "What about it?" "I denied boarding to an unauthorized passenger at 2,315 hours. 20 minutes later, that same aircraft departed with what appeared to be the same individual in the pilot's seat." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Webb's face with the careful attention of someone trying to determine how much information was safe to share. "Marcus, how long have you been working restricted gates?" 8 years. "And in those 8 years, how many times have you been asked to explain unusual circumstances involving flights you're not clear to know about?" Webb thought about it. "Maybe a dozen times. But I've never had someone I denied boarding end up piloting the aircraft." Morrison pulled out a file folder that had been locked in her desk drawer, the kind of security that suggested contents were classified above Webb's clearance level. "Marcus, I'm going to tell you something, and then we're going to forget this conversation happened. Some of the flights that operate out of these restricted gates involve personnel whose identities are compartmentalized for operational security reasons. Sometimes the same person who appears to be an unauthorized passenger is actually the most qualified individual on the aircraft." "I don't understand." "You're not supposed to understand. That's the point of operational security. But I can tell you this. The man you encountered last night has been flying C-130 Hercules transports since before you started working airport security. His qualifications are classified, his mission history is classified, and his presence on Flight 847 was authorized at levels well above your security clearance or mine." Webb stared at Morrison, processing implications that challenged everything he thought he understood about airport security protocols. "So when I denied him boarding, you followed standard procedure with the information available to you. But there are layers of authorization that don't appear on passenger manifests, clearances that exist outside normal channels, and personnel whose official identities are designed to be questioned by security checkpoints." "Why?" Morrison closed the file folder and locked it back in her desk drawer. "Because sometimes the most important missions require the most ordinary disguises. And sometimes the best way to ensure operational security is to make sure that even airport security doesn't know who's really on the aircraft." Webb left Morrison's office with more questions and answers, but he'd learned enough to understand that the questions he was asking weren't meant to be answered by people at a security clearance level. Flight 847 had departed with authorized personnel for a mission he wasn't clear to know about, operated by a pilot whose qualifications were classified for reasons he wasn't clear to understand. But the image stayed with him. A man in worn jeans and a wrinkled shirt, accepting denial at a security checkpoint with the calm resignation of someone who understood that appearances were often deceiving and that true qualifications weren't always visible to people checking boarding passes at airport gates. 3 days later, Webb was working his regular shift when he noticed an unusual amount of activity around the restricted tarmac areas. Ground crews were preparing aircraft that hadn't moved in months. Fuel trucks were servicing transports that were officially decommissioned, and personnel were moving around the area with the purposeful urgency that suggested something significant was happening. His radio crackled with a message from flight operations. "All security stations, be advised that restricted airspace operations will be conducted over the next 72 hours. Increased activity in Tarmac Zone 7 through 12 is authorized and expected." Webb looked through his binoculars at the activity on the tarmac. Among the ground crews and military personnel, he recognized several individuals whose presence at the airport had previously raised questions. People who appeared to be civilians but move with military precision, who carry credentials that required verification through classified channels, who seem to know more about aircraft operations than their apparent positions would suggest. And their Supervising the pre-flight inspection of transport that was supposedly being operated by contract pilots was a man from Gate 47, not wearing worn jeans and a wrinkled shirt this time, but dressed in a flight suit that clearly belonged to him, moving around the aircraft with the familiarity of someone who'd spent years working with a specific type of transport. Webb grabbed his radio. "Flight operations, this is Security Station 7. I'm observing pre-flight operations on AC 130 in Tarmac Zone 9. Can you verify the pilot credentials for today's missions?" Security Station 7. All flight crews are properly certified and authorized. Is there a specific security concern? Webb watched through his binoculars as the man completed his aircraft inspection with a methodical thoroughness that came from years of experience. Every check was performed with precision. Every system was verified with the kind of attention to detail that suggested intimate familiarity with the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. "No security concern," Webb replied, just confirming that all personnel are properly authorized. But as he watched the man climb into the cockpit and begin his pre-flight checklist, Webb realized that properly authorized was a phrase that carried implications he was only beginning to understand. The man who had been denied boarding 3 nights ago wasn't an unauthorized passenger trying to catch a flight. He was a qualified pilot whose credentials were classified at levels that didn't appear on standard passenger manifests. The engine spun up with the smooth precision that came from expert operation, and as the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Webb caught a glimpse of the pilot through the cockpit windows. For just a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and the pilot raised his hand in a slight acknowledgement. Not a wave, not a salute, just a brief recognition between two professionals who understood that some aspect of their work couldn't be discussed in official reports. As the aircraft lifted off and disappeared into the afternoon sky, Webb made a note in his log. Authorized military transport. Departure 1,430 hours. All personnel properly cleared. Standard procedure, by the book authorization. But he knew that the truth was more complex than his log entries could capture, and that some of the most important work done at airports like this one involved people whose qualifications couldn't be verified through normal channels. The story might have ended there, with Webb filing his reports and returning to the routine of airport security, except that the man from Gate 47 returned 2 weeks later. Not as a passenger trying to board a restricted flight, but as an instructor leading a group of military pilots through advanced training exercises that hadn't been conducted at civilian airports in over a decade. Webb watched through his binoculars as the man demonstrated flying techniques that pushed the C-130 Hercules beyond its normal operational parameters. Steep climbs, tight turns, landing approaches that seemed to defy the aircraft's design limitations. And throughout the demonstration, his movements in the cockpit were smooth, confident, and precise in ways that suggested he wasn't just qualified to fly the aircraft, but intimately familiar with capabilities that most pilots never explored. During a break in the training exercises, the man walked across the tarmac toward the terminal, moving with the same measured pace that had characterized his approach to Gate 47 2 weeks earlier. This time, he was wearing a flight suit with insignia that Webb couldn't quite make out at this distance, but the way other pilots deferred to him suggested rank and experience that commanded respect. As he approached the security checkpoint, Webb recognized the same calm confidence that had marked their first encounter. But this time, the man was carrying credentials that were clearly authorized, identification that would pass any security verification, and documentation that left no questions about his right to be in restricted areas of the airport. "Evening, Officer Webb," the man said, reading the name tag with a slight smile. "I believe we met a couple weeks ago." Webb studied the man's face, looking for some indication of anger or resentment about being denied boarding. Instead, he found only the same quiet amusement that had characterized their first interaction. "Yes, sir, at Gate 47. I had to deny you boarding on Flight 847. You were doing your job. Security protocols exist for good reasons, and you followed them exactly as you were trained to do. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, why didn't you show me proper credentials that night?" You clearly have the authorization to be here. The man was quiet for a moment, considering his response. Officer Webb, sometimes the most important part of operational security is making sure that normal procedures work exactly as they're supposed to. If security checkpoints start making exceptions for people who claim to have special authorization, then the entire system becomes vulnerable to exploitation. So you allowed yourself to be denied boarding to test the system? I allowed myself to be processed through normal channels because normal channels are what keep this airport secure. The fact that you questioned my presence, verified my credentials through proper procedures, and denied access when those procedures indicated denial was appropriate, that tells me the system is working. Webb realized that he'd been thinking about their first encounter in the wrong context. The man hadn't been trying to board Flight 847 as a passenger. He'd been evaluating airport security procedures by presenting himself as someone who should be denied access, confirming that security personnel would follow protocol even when dealing with individuals whose true authorization wasn't immediately obvious. Sir, were you testing me specifically, or was this part of a larger security evaluation? The man smiled again, the same slight expression Webb remembered from Gate 47. Officer Webb, the best security evaluations are the ones that don't feel like evaluations. You responded to an unusual situation exactly as you were trained to respond. That's valuable information for people who need to know that airport security protocols are effective. As the man walked back toward the tarmac where his aircraft was being prepared for another training flight, Webb realized that some of the most important work done in airport security involved interactions that seemed routine at the time, but carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The man who had been denied boarding at Gate 47 wasn't just a qualified pilot whose credentials were classified. He was someone whose job included evaluating the effectiveness of security procedures by testing them under realistic conditions. And Webb's response to that test had apparently met whatever standards were being evaluated. So you allowed yourself to be denied boarding to test the system? I allow myself to be processed through normal channels because normal channels are what keep this airport secure. The fact that you questioned my presence, verified my credentials through proper procedures, and denied access when those procedures indicated denial was appropriate, that tells me the system is working. Webb realized that he'd been thinking about their first encounter in the wrong context. The man hadn't been trying to board Flight 847 as a passenger. He'd been evaluating airport security procedures by presenting himself as someone who should be denied access, confirming that security personnel would follow protocol even when dealing with individuals whose true authorization wasn't immediately obvious. Sir, were you testing me specifically, or was this part of a larger security evaluation? The man smiled again, the same slight expression Webb remembered from Gate 47. Officer Webb, the best security evaluations are the ones that don't feel like evaluations. You responded to an unusual situation exactly as you were trained to respond. That's valuable information for people who need to know that airport security protocols are effective. As the man walked back toward the tarmac where his aircraft was being prepared for another training flight, Webb realized that some of the most important work done in airport security involved interactions that seemed routine at the time, but carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The man who had been denied boarding at Gate 47 wasn't just a qualified pilot whose credentials were classified. He was someone whose job included evaluating the effectiveness of security procedures by testing them under realistic conditions. And Webb's response to that test had apparently met whatever standards were being evaluated. Over the following months, Webb began to notice patterns in restrictive flight operations that he'd previously missed. Personnel who appeared to be civilians but moved with military precision. Aircraft that were officially decommissioned but maintained operational standards. Flights that weren't listed on any public manifest but operated with the regularity of scheduled service. And occasionally, he would see the man from Gate 47, sometimes in civilian clothes that made him look like any other passenger, sometimes in flight suits that marked him as qualified aircrew, always moving through the airport with the same quiet confidence that suggested he belonged exactly where he was, regardless of how he was dressed. Webb learned not to ask questions about flights he wasn't clear to understand. personnel whose credentials were classified above his security clearance, or operations that existed parallel to the commercial aviation activities that most airport employees were familiar with. But he also learned to recognize the difference between genuine security threats and authorized personnel whose true qualifications weren't immediately obvious. The lesson from Gate 47 stayed with him. Sometimes the most important security work involved following standard procedures precisely, even when dealing with individuals whose authorization existed at levels beyond normal verification channels. And sometimes the best compliment a security officer could receive was the quiet acknowledgement from someone whose job was to ensure that security protocols worked exactly as they were designed to work. The man never told Webb his name, his rank, or the nature of the missions that brought him to the airport's restricted areas. But Webb understood that some aspect of airport security involved protecting operations he wasn't clear to know about, conducted by people whose identities were compartmentalized for reasons that extended beyond his need to understand. Years later, when Webb trained new security officers on the protocols for handling restricted flights and classified personnel, he would tell them about the night when he denied boarding to someone who turned out to be the most qualified pilot on the aircraft, not as an example of mistake, but as an illustration of why security procedures existed and why following them precisely was sometimes the most important contribution an officer could make to operations that were bigger than any individual checkpoint or any single flight. The man from Gate 47 had taught him that true professionalism sometimes involved accepting denial with grace, understanding that appearances could be deceiving, and recognizing that the most important qualifications weren't always visible to people checking credentials at airport security stations. And in a world where aviation security depended on the careful balance between access and restriction, between authorization and verification, between what people appear to be and what they actually were, that lesson made Webb a better security officer and a more effective guardian of operations he would never fully understand but had learned to protect with quiet professionalism. Some legends don't need recognition. Some heroes work best when their true capabilities remain hidden until the moment when extraordinary skill becomes necessary. And sometimes the most important flights are the ones that officially never happened, operated by pilots whose names don't appear on any manifest, carrying passengers whose destinations are classified at levels above the security clearance of the officers who watched them disappear into the night sky. The man from Gate 47 was one of those legends, and the story of his denied boarding became a reminder that in aviation security, as in many aspects of professional life, things are not always what they appear to be, and the most important work is often done by people whose true qualifications are known only to those who need to know. Chat Control Sonnet 4.